This is going to be a presentation on the foundation. And for me, this is honestly a lot of what I still use today. The basic stuff, honestly, is the most effective stuff. Every time I find myself working with a client and I find myself getting in the weeds with them, I find myself going really deep into complex stuff and complex positions, complex exercises, I always try to remind myself of maybe we're going too far. Let's bring it back to the very beginning and let's try to go over the basics a little bit more. And almost every single time that gives me a better result than if I keep going into the complex stuff. So there's a lot of value in this presentation for you. What we're going to cover specifically is the basic muscle function in the human body, basically how muscles work, and then relating biomechanics to that and movement. We're going to go over the phases of gait, which is very important if we want to start to translate these phases of gait over to biasing joint positions, joint actions, certain musculature, and movement qualities. And then finally, we're going to go over some assessments and we're going to go over some exercises that I think are the best bang for the buck stuff that I use. There's no really secrets being held here. I am going to give you the exercises I think work the best for most people. Okay, a lot of you, I'm not sure exactly what the population is of this audience, but I would assume that a lot of us are trainers. A couple people are probably not trainers, but let's go over the very basics of muscles because this is going to be important if we want to understand what we can do to improve movement. I promise this will be very relevant. So we have two types of muscles in terms of joint actions. We have agonists and antagonists. Agonists are the primary musculature. I'll move myself out of the way right here so you can kind of see what I'm getting at here. You can kind of think about it as the prime mover. So if I'm going to do a biceps curl, my agonist is going to be my biceps. And if I'm going to extend my hip and stand up, my glutes would be an agonist involved in that. The antagonist is going to be the primary muscles on the opposite side, usually of the joint, that oppose that movement. That would be, for example, the triceps in that bicep curl example, and the hip flexors would oppose the glutes in hip extension. This is important because we need to slow ourselves down or else we would have too much momentum moving in one direction. If we didn't have something slowing us down, we would not be able to control that joint action. So we need this antagonist to be an important primary player in a different way than the agonist. They're both very, very important, but ultimately we need the agonist to work with the antagonist and vice versa. And then this is going to determine how effective contractions, recruitment, and positions can be. So we have two types of attachment sites. The first one would be a monoarticular muscle, meaning that it really only attaches to one joint. So it's a pretty simplified process of how that muscle contracts. But if we have multiple attachment sites on different joints, then this can act a little bit differently. And things tend to get a little bit complex with these types of muscles. So we'll try to keep it pretty simple. But essentially what you can think of it as one attachment site is going to pull, the other is going to stabilize. So you can think about it as, let's go back to the biceps curl. This is a really simple example. We're going to have the distal further away attachment site pull while the origin is going to stabilize that movement. This is how we can isolate this segment of elbow flexion without anything crazy happening at the shoulder. In terms of how this process actually goes underway, there's the sliding filament theory, which is currently the leading theory as to how these muscles actually contract. And this will feed into the idea of length tension relationships, which we will talk about on the next slide. But you can basically think about it as we contract the muscle, it kind of winds and unwinds together. It's not a straight line pull because look at how these myosin heads attached to the actin. This actin kind of looks like DNA almost. So the contraction process, regardless of if the movement is in a straight line, untwists and twists like so. It's helical in nature, so to speak. But in order for us to have leverage to actually create a strong contraction, we have to have a degree of resting slack or neutrality. And this is, again, like I mentioned, relative But if you're in a shortened position relative to your starting point, that's a concentric orientation as I refer to it. If you are in a lengthened position relative to your starting position or your resting position, that would be an eccentric orientation. But if I'm going to contract a muscle, but my bicep is already contracted, that's not going to be very effective. I have to start from a position of relative length. That's a really important concept. So people that have trouble feeling muscles, sometimes they're already in a concentric orientation, or they're too eccentric and they're having a hard time overcoming that lengthened position to create an optimal contraction. So you can have it both ways. What I'm trying to say with this slide is a muscle can feel tight or limited in its ability to contribute to movement because it is long or because it is short. Most people think because a muscle is short, that means it's strong, not necessarily. And a muscle is long, that means it's weak, not necessarily. You can have it both ways. On the same page so far? Okay. Let's go over some basic biomechanics. I'm going to whip out my pelvic model in a second here. But we're going to go over first the planes of general movement. So we have three main planes. If you look at any biomechanical textbook, they're going to talk about the sagittal plane, which is front, back, up, down movement. We're going to have the frontal plane, which is side to side movement, and the transverse plane, which is rotation. Now, you can make the argument that because of what I spoke upon earlier with this unwinding and winding, that every single movement we do always is rotational in nature, even if it occurs in the sagittal plane. But that's a different story for a different day. What we're just trying to establish here is where is this movement taking place in space? With location terminology, you can look at this in terms of the planes themselves. I don't really care if you know every single one of these, but basically just know that posterior means back, anterior means front, lateral is out there, medial is in here, proximal means close, distal means further away from the midline of the body. Those are the ones that I think are the most important. I'm not really going to combine these terms, but you technically could. Just know these 6 right here are the most important that we're going to be talking about. And I'll clarify because it can be a little bit confusing if you haven't been using this terminology consistently. Now, here's where it really gets within the plane of motions. Flexion means something coming forward. Extension means something moving backwards. When we talk about the pelvis, this will be very, very important. So if I flex, you can think about that rounding forward. Extend, move back. Abduction means moving away laterally from the midline of the body. Adduction means moving in a sideways plane of motion towards the midline of the body. External rotation would be rotating away from the midline of the body for the most part. Internal rotation is rotating inwards towards the midline of the body for the most part. I think most people are familiar with these terms, but it's good to sort of get it in a broad general context before going very, very specific. Okay, now let's get into what everyone's been waiting for. So we have 2 types of pelvic movement. Now, I know this image on the right can look a little bit confusing, but it's very important to establish the difference between these 2 types of motion, which are orientation and relative motion. I have a video of this right here, but I'm going to show you. But relative motion means these segments are moving relative towards one another. So if this middle sacrum bone moves, then you're probably going to see some movement happen of those outside innominate or pelvic bones. Orientation just means that the whole thing is moving as one unit. You can think about this as a penguin walking. This is human movement. Relative motion and orientation is moving as one unit. You're moving like a refrigerator. There's not a whole lot of that relative motion happening. So relative motion, orientation. People who are very, very stiff and walk around like very tight powerlifters or bodybuilders, for example, don't have a lot of relative motion. They're moving with orientation, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it could lead to some issues down the road, potentially. We have 2 types of relative motion for the most part. We have nutation and counter nutation. This can happen on one or both sides. But what that looks like is counter nutation means the sacrum bone extends, moves back in space, and then these bones move forward relative to the sacrum. I have another slide that goes into more detail on that. So think about it like this. If this middle sacrum bone right here tips back, these bones look like they tip back too, right? But they don't. Relatively speaking, they're moving forward. And I'll make myself much bigger so you guys can visualize this in a second. This is extension of the sacrum with flexion of the innominate bones. That's why they call it relative movement, because it's literally happening. This is dissociation to a certain extent. It's relative to these two bones. Without one, you can't have the other. Nutation is the opposite. The sacrum flexes, comes forwards, and then these bones rotate back relative to that. That would be internal rotation, adduction and extension of these two bones, while this sacrum bone goes into flexion. Let's look at that on a bigger screen so you guys can actually visualize that a little bit. All right. Am I big for everyone? Good. Okay. So we have sacrum tipping back, extension, right? Look at what the innominate bones do as a result of that. Flexion, abduction, external rotation of the innominate bones as the sacrum tips back. And the femurs will follow suit, as we see in a second. Or we could have this bone come forward, and then these bones have to rotate in. Adduction, internal rotation, extension of these bones, but flexion of this bone, the sacrum. Which one do you think has more stability? This one or this one? Does this look like it's stable, or does this closed packed position look stable? This is what creates force. This is what's responsible for creating compression. When I say compression, I'm talking about this, because this is creating that closed packed position of the pelvis. This is how we produce force. We will seek to create a strategy to find this if we don't have it. This is force absorption. Think about these spreading out like petals on a flower for us to absorb the force. The pelvic floor drops. Pelvic floor ascends, creates force. Pelvic floor is a whole nother story. But it is intimately tied to these two joint actions right here. Okay. We can also have this happen on one side or the other. We're going to get into that in a minute, but this is the basic foundation that can happen on both sides at the same time. In terms of the femur and how that's going to affect the rest of the lower body, you can think of a swing dance. The pelvis is the lead, the femurs are the follow for the most part. If I go into internal rotation and nutation, then I'm going to create internal rotation of the femoral bones. That will feed into, or under most circumstances should feed into, tibial internal rotation, pronation of the foot. On the other end of the spectrum, we can have external rotation of the innominate bones paired with counter nutation and ER of the innominate bones right here. So you can see how that would open up space for these bones to turn out, right? Whereas nutation would create space for these bones to move in. Again, I'll show you that bigger in a second. This, though, the supination is paired with ER at the pelvis. So think about it like this. If I ER'd my pelvis, externally rotated it, I should see some degree of supination occur at the foot. But if I supinate my foot, under most circumstances, I should see some degree of external rotation at my pelvis. If I pronate my foot, same thing, but nutation and IR. If I internally rotate and nutate, I should see some degree of pronation in many, but not all circumstances. But for the basics, the foundation, it's this. Okay, so let's look at that again. If I nutate, come together, these bones have room to move in, yeah? That feeds down into the tibia, which turns in, and then you've got your foot, which should do this, right? Or if I supinate my foot, do that, that's what? This tibia moving away from the midline of the body, rotating away into external rotation, which means that you should see a degree of that happening. That makes sense to everyone? Give me a thumbs up if we're all on the same page. Okay. Let's go over muscles, and I've held off on talking about muscles responsible for this, and we're going to keep it pretty basic. But these are the primary muscles we're concerned with, because your joint position dictates how your muscles are going to work and how they can work. And we'll get into that in a second after we go over the primary hip extensors. We have the glute max and the hamstrings responsible for extending the hip, meaning bringing the hip into a position where it can be fully underneath us. So let's look at that in a little bit bigger context right here. These muscles on the backside of the pelvis have leverage to extend the hip like so. So if we're going to extend the hip, we have to come from a position of relative hip flexion, right? How are we going to extend the hip if we're already extended at the hip? So if we're in a position of nutation at deeper levels of hip flexion like this, let's say we're at the bottom of a squat, these muscles have leverage to compress here, pull the pelvis underneath us, or concentrically orient to help stand us back up. So that's what's important to understand about joint position. If I'm already in a position where these, let's say I had a lot of tightness back here, and then I tried to extend my hip, my glutes are already in a concentric orientation, so they can't act to do that very effectively. These could be your people who have tight butt syndrome. They can't feel like their glutes ever let go, or they can't feel their glutes at all. See, it can be both. And there are different contexts. I'm just going over the basics right now for people, but this is, again, what you see under most circumstances. Hip flexors primarily, I know there's more, but psoas, rectus femoris are the ones that we're going to be focused on creating that hip flexion, but you have to come from a place of relative hip extension. Hopefully you're sensing a theme here. Hip external rotators, which mean that when I say hip, I'm referring to the pelvic bones right here. The muscles that do this right here primarily are the glute max, the piriformis, the posterior fibers of the glute med, the lateral outside biceps femoris muscle, the hamstring muscle, which we'll see on the next slide. But in terms of creating external rotation of the pelvis, we have to come from a position of relative internal rotation. That doesn't mean we have to be fully internally rotated. That just means that we have to come from a place where we're less externally rotated. Primary hip internal rotators are going to be the inner hamstring muscles, the semi-brothers is what I like to call them, the anterior fibers of the glute med, the front-facing ones, the ones closer to the front of your body, the TFL, which is on the outside of the pelvis, and the adductors, which depend on what position you're in, but they do help create internal rotation in many circumstances. So muscles that are more closer to the inline of the body generally have more leverage to create more internal rotation, right? And as for the foot, the ones that create more dorsiflexion and pronation, which is coupled with tibial internal rotation, femoral internal rotation, pelvic internal rotation, are going to be the tibialis anterior. The gastroc and soleus help create plantar flexion, which is coupled with a position of the foot that looks like so. You can call this pronation, dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, right? That's going to be gastroc, soleus primarily. Okay, so we got this stuff out of the way. Now let's go over gait. Are we on the same page so far? All right. Seeing a couple head nods, that's good. So now we're going to get into the weeds a little bit. We go from a position, relatively speaking, of external rotation to internal rotation back to external rotation when we walk, run, squat, deadlift, do pretty much anything. We're going from ER to IR back to ER. Extremely important concept to know. That's going to set the stage for how we address problems. So if we're going to move from a position of external rotation to internal rotation, look at this graph right here. We have to start from a position of relative ER to go to IR, back to ER again. This down here can look a little bit confusing because, wait a second, internally rotating, externally rotating, then back to internally rotating. Think about it like this. It's an active process. So we are not internally rotated or externally rotated. You could look at it that way, but we're dynamic people. We're dynamic creatures. So we move through an active process of ing. We are internally rotating or externally rotating. But how do you think we are internally rotating? We're moving from a place of external rotation, right? Relatively speaking. This applies to both the hips and the shoulders. Shoulders are a different story for a different day. We're talking about the pelvis and lower body right now. So we're moving from these relative positions, and this is going to set the stage for what muscles can work and how they can work. Now, we did a lot of things on the pelvic model that were on both sides of the body at the same time, but ultimately we alternate between joint actions on different sides of the body when we walk or run. When we are in extension on one leg right here, we are in flexion in the other. Extension of one arm, flexion of internal rotation on one side, external rotation on the other. Abduction on one side, adduction on the other. So when I am walking or moving, I'm going to be moving where external rotation on one side, internal rotation on the other. Counter nutation on one side, nutation on the other. I can't have more counter nutation on one side without having more nutation on the other. It's impossible. You have to have this. And also, by the way, I'm exaggerating this pelvic and SI joint movement. It's not this. That would be crazy. It's really more subtle than that. But for the purposes of illustration, I'm moving it more significantly. Okay, heel strike. Heel strike is a position that a lot of people are not that great at. And we'll talk about why later. But it's actually not really a heavy concentric movement. Think about what happens when you take a step forward with your foot. What do you need to do? In order for the other side to come forward, you have to slow yourself down, or else you're just going to keep going forward on that side and that leg will never come. If the right leg is forward, we have to slow the right side down so the left side can come forward. So it's more eccentric in nature, and we should strike on the lateral border of our heel, which will allow us to create external rotation and move into a position of internal rotation. So we're not getting a lot of internal rotation quite yet, but we are rapidly moving towards it when we strike the ground, as you will see. So think of heel strike. Predominantly, if you were to take a snapshot of heel strike, you would be in counter nutation on that side, external rotation on that side, and supination of the foot, relatively speaking, on that side. But we are moving rapidly towards a position of internal rotation once we hit the ground. Look at this graph right here. I think it does such a good job. I love this image. Look at how it shows when we hit the ground, we rapidly, from about 0 to 20% of the gait cycle, go towards internal rotation real fast. But after we leave the ground, we're just kind of humming around, moving slowly towards it. But right when we hit the ground, we have to start internally rotating fast. Why is that? Do you guys remember how I talked about internal rotation being a force-producing action? That's because it keeps us putting force into the ground so we don't fall. If I took a step forward with my left foot and I didn't move towards internal rotation, I would just be stuck in a position where I'm absorbing force and I would collapse into the ground. We got to put force into the ground. Remember, that's just physics, equal and opposite action. So we have to be able to move towards internal rotation. But once we strike the ground, we are in a position of external rotation, relatively speaking. So at the pelvis, it looks like this. Let's say my left foot's coming forward. We're here. Okay. The femur is out here. And then because our foot is on the ground, we're going to move towards internal rotation like this. The pelvis is moving on the femur because the foot is fixated on the ground. The foot is in a position like so, and we are not quite pronating or doing anything that requires the arch to drop quite yet. You can think of heel strike as being over once this big toe hits the ground. The transition from here to here is heel strike. It's not just this. It's here to here, because that sets the stage for that to happen. Mid stance is a position of internal rotation. Therefore, you are going to see muscles that internally rotate become much more active. The concentrically oriented muscles are going to be the hamstring muscles, more so on the inner side of the leg, and the proximal hamstring muscles that are more responsible for extending the hip underneath us. The anterior glute med, the TFL, are going to be concentrically oriented, and the adductors are actually eccentrically oriented. I know it can be confusing, but it's because the adductors have leverage to work as internal rotators. When we're in deeper levels of hip flexion, think about like your leg being parallel in a squat. We'll see that in a second, but the adductors actually don't have leverage to create internal rotation quite as much when you are fully standing up, because they need to be in deeper levels of hip flexion for that to happen. But there's still primary internal rotators under many circumstances, just not in this one. The TFL is actually really important for mid stance and internal rotation. So we are loading all of our weight onto this side. So we have to put a lot of force into the ground to stay upright. Think about it like that. So we are in a position up to about 20% of the gait cycle in nutation, internal rotation, pronation of the foot. If we look at this on the pelvic model, we are going to be moving from a place where we're here, heel strike, nutation, here to here, okay? That's really important to know, because that's going to feed force into the ground for us to be able to get tibial internal rotation, boom, to here. Now, as we are internally rotating at the tibia, this arch will drop, and this will set the stage for what happens in late stance, as we will see in a second. Late stance is primarily an external rotation action, but we're going to have not as much concentric orientation as you might think. Gait is very much, think about it like a controlled fall. Momentum is carrying us forward. It's not as much muscularly driven. Running is a different story. You can think about this, you can just kind of amp a lot of this up for running. It's not exactly the same, but it's quite similar. Concentric orientation is going to be low levels of your glute max, calves, adductor magnus for hip extension. The hamstrings, the distal fibers, are going to be slowing down the extension of the knee, the locking out of the knee. The internal rotators, ankle dorsiflexors, psoas are going to be stretched. So think about the stretch, because we are in extension, the psoas is going to stretch so that when we take a step forward, we're going to allow for that. Let me make myself bigger here. If I take a step forward, this gets stretched so I can use momentum to bring myself through. On the pelvic model, you're looking at this. So heel strike, mid stance, and then this bone is going to create the external rotation to help push us back to the other side. Okay. So the glute is going to close this space right here, and we go, this bone moves here like so. Okay, so now you're on external rotation on both sides of the body, but you're in more extension here as a whole. The pelvis tipped forward like so. That will allow us to go from here to there. Make sense? Let's talk about the foot while we're still here. Guys, remember how the foot pronates here? That sets a stretch on the bottom of this right here, the intrinsic foot musculature. So a lot of the muscles of the foot are actually supinator muscles, meaning they create this rather than this. That's important because when we stretch this out, that's going to allow for that length tension relationship to change so we can then create that spring. And now we're back to external rotation right here. That's what's happening at the foot. That's why we need to pronate, so we can take advantage of that spring back up. So that's why the joint actions, if you were to take a snapshot at late stance, we'd be back from, we went from ER to IR, now we're back to ER. We're at counter nutation, external rotation of the pelvis, external rotation of the femur, feeding down, down, down into the foot, which is now supinating again. You guys can see that happen right here. After about 20%, we start to move back towards external rotation. You guys can see that happen here. What about other types of movement? What if we're just going through a squat or we're going through a deadlift? Well, we have this graph right here, which is really helpful for breaking that down. So we have the hip flexion movement arc. This is a general guideline, not a hard and fast rule, but it's really, really helpful for having us understand what happens when we move through hip flexion, meaning that a squat. Think about it like that. That's the easiest way of thinking about it. From 0 to 60 degrees, we are in an externally rotated position, and that is going to be paired with the joint actions of flexion, abduction, external rotation, plantar flexion, supination. Right? That makes sense because all these things, if we go back to one of the very first slides on biomechanics, these are tied together under many circumstances. From 60 to about 110 degrees, we are going to be in more nutation and internal rotation, meaning that we are extended, adducted, internally rotated at the pelvis. Pronation and dorsiflexion are happening at the foot. So we move from here, and then as we go down deeper and do about 90 degrees, we're here. But then, you guys ever seen a butt wink in a squat? Think about what happens when we get really, really low in a squat, but we can't find that external rotation we need to have again. What's going to happen? We're going to roll our hips underneath ourselves because we can't create in deeper levels of hip flexion. We need to do this again. So if we can't do this, which is a relative motion, we're going to find an orientation to find this. So we might be stuck here and we might just do that. So that's a representation of using an orientation as a substitution for relative motion. You're going to see that in the assessments a lot. Think about it like this as well. If I'm in a deadlift, if I'm going to do a bilateral barbell deadlift, and I don't have the internal rotation or the nutation to create that closed packed position like this, I'm going to find it via the path of least resistance where one joint higher at the lumbar spine, I might overextend my lumbar spine and do this so that I can move my pelvis as a whole unit into internal rotation. Or if I can't do that, I might round my back too much because I'm stuck maybe in this counter-nutated position where I'm here. And then if you put me in a hinge position, think of all those people you have that can't hinge very well. And they have that rounded lower back position. They can't usually nutate. In addition to the fact that they probably just haven't learned how to do the movement very well. Okay, now let's assess for what's missing. Are we missing internal rotation? Are we missing external rotation? Are we missing on one or both sides? And what do we do about it? The active hip extension test is going to tell you if this person is stuck in an anterior orientation, as many people are. What you're trying to do is you're trying to bring that leg back, keeping it in line with the body, not having it go too high or too low. And you're trying to make sure that that low back is not going to flare. If you see that low back move before they get their knee in line with their hip, then you know that it's no good. I'm going to send you guys all these videos in a playlist in an email after this is over. So don't sweat it if you're a little bit, if you're not fully grasping this. But you're testing for internal rotation at full hip extension and obviously full hip extension, as the name of the test suggests. So we'll know this test is over when you see the active leg rise or drop. And then let's see if I have a visual of that back extending early. I do. So right here, if that low back moves before that hip gets back, as most people will, then we know that that's a compensation. And we know that that person is substituting that internal rotation and they're arching their low back because they don't have full hip extension. Most people are not going to pass this initially. The overwhelming majority of them will not. If you see their pelvis roll to one side or the other, the test is over. If you see any sort of movement where that pelvis is moving like this, test is over. If you see any sort of movement where this leg comes really high or drops really low, test is over because they're not keeping it in line. So this would be an indication that, let's say someone is stuck with a pelvis that's forward, which most people are. Why is that? Because a lot of people are trying to achieve a position of going forward in space. If you look for why people are missing internal rotation, you're going to solve a lot of people's problems. How is this person finding internal rotation? If you ask yourself that question, you can solve most problems. So if I'm forward, what does that do? That orients my pelvis or my femurs into internal rotation so I can put force down into the ground. So that allows me to go forward because internal rotation is something a lot of people don't have, or they have it in a compensatory manner. So if I lay myself down then and I try to bring this leg back, ooh, I can't do that. What am I going to do? I'm just going to do that. From your perspective, as I bring this leg back, what am I going to do? Ooh, can't do that. I'm just going to do that. Stuck here, arch here. And that creates fake hip extension. So to summarize, if their back extends early, they're probably in an anterior orientation, or anterior pelvic tilt is what I also call that. If they can't get their knee in line with their hip, they're missing extension of the hip, internal rotation, all that good stuff. Knee in line with the hip is adequate active hip extension. Most people are going to be just fine if they can sufficiently bring that leg back and control that. You could also make it a passive test, which is similar to an Ober's test. You can look that up. I have a video of that if you guys would like that as well. And the Ober's test actually has an additional component to it, but usually you want someone to be able to pass both. But this is a really good test to see if they have active hip extension. Hip flexion is a test that I think is honestly essential. I think that this test tells us so much of what this person is capable of. What you're looking for is 120 degrees relative to the starting position, which that's about 120 degrees right there. You're making sure that that leg is not deviating out to the side, because if it does, we're going to talk about what that is in a second. That's a compensation. So it should be perfectly in line like so. If you see them do, I got to find it. If you see this other hamstring come off of the floor, think about what that entails. If you see this happen, that other leg's got to stay down because they're staying in hip extension on one side. And as that comes back, oh, that's just cheating. They're rolling their pelvis underneath themselves as a whole unit. If that leg deviates out, the test is over. If they feel a hip flexor pinch, the test is over, because you know that they're just pushing beyond what they're capable of at that point. What if they start in a position where they're forward like this and you lay them down on a table? What is that? Hamstrings are off the ground. That means they're probably extended. But if they can fling their leg back and they get to what you think is 120 degrees, but they started already off the table, did they really get 120 degrees? I don't think so. Now, hip flexion is testing for external rotation of the innominate bone. It's testing for, think about the hip flexion arc. It's testing for, if this is the active leg, this. So if my goal is to get it to here, and I am trying to do this, what is external rotation? You guys remember I said external rotation is out there? What is it going to do? If I bring this leg back, I'm going to want to do that. I'm going to want to turn that leg out, or I'm going to want to roll my pelvis this way. This is the most common thing you'll see. You'll see people do that. And this is moving via an orientation, not getting this. So we want at least 110 degrees, if not 120 degrees. And we have to use our common sense. If you're a power lifter and you have 90 degrees of hip flexion, do you ever want to get 120 degrees? I don't know, maybe not. But if you're the average desk worker, yeah, I probably want you at 110, 120. Is it even worth getting 120 if you're a power lifter? Think about the population that you are or you work with, and that's going to dictate what you're looking for. So if they get to 60 to about 110, that means they're in an anterior orientation. That means that they're biased towards internal rotation, probably compensatorily. If they get to 110, 120, that means that they can counter nutate the sacrum. And that means that the sacrum can move on the, that turn just means this. That means that they can create the ability to get that sacrum and pelvis to move together and create that external rotation. If they get more than 130 degrees, the human body doesn't have that. We don't have the ability to get to 130 degrees of active hip flexion. So what does that mean? That means that they're starting in a position where they're doing this. That means that they're flinging their leg back, but they're probably starting with their hamstrings off the ground, or they're bringing this back and they're crunching their pelvis underneath themselves. So pay very close attention to what you see. At the end of this, I'm going to take you guys through an assessment of these three things. I'm going to show you guys some examples of people who do that. It'll be really, really helpful. The straight leg raise is a measurement of more internal rotation. And the reason why, we'll come back to this, is because of the screw home mechanism. If we extend our leg, that creates internal rotation relatively of the femur, external rotation of the tibia. That's going to tighten our knee ligaments, which, fun fact, if you guys see a lot of ACL tears or you see a lot of any of these really ligament tears, a lot of the times their knee extends in an awkward manner, or they get hit with their knee extended, or you see something else happen where their knee dives in too much. That's a different story. But a lot of these contact injuries with the leg extended tend to overstress these ligaments. But back to this right here. We're looking for only about 70 to 80 degrees here. Think about the hip flexion arc, right? What happens from 60 to 110 degrees? We're in internal rotation. So we only want, and I believe I get to about, it's about 70 degrees right there. So this is a genuine measurement of 70 degrees. I don't want 100-degree straight leg raise, because that means that this person, as you'll see, is starting in an anterior pelvic tilt. It doesn't make sense. Why would I want them to have a very long hamstring or the ability to compensate like that? So what we're looking for is a perfectly straight leg. If you see this is the thing. If you see that knee bend 1 degree, 1 sliver of a degree, the test is over. People can get back really far, but their knee bends. Trevor's knee's already starting to bend. If you see any semblance of that, I'm calling the test immediately. Some people call, you got to look at where they're starting relatively. So he's good, he's good, he's good. Oh, that other leg lifts off the ground, test is over. Knee starts to bend, test is over. They roll in their pelvis, test is over. So even this, too much knee bend. Why would they lift up the other leg off the ground? Because they are missing either hip extension on the down leg, they can't create that dissociation in their pelvis, or they're rolling on the table. So people can roll. This leg can come up right here. If I'm bringing this leg back, and I do that, See how that would create that leg coming off of the table? So this is the hardest part of this whole webinar because there's a lot of things to look out for, but we're going to go through it later after I'm done presenting. And I think that will be really helpful for you all. So we need nutation to occur on this side. Now, if we don't, some people have a really limited straight leg raise. Some people have a 45-degree or less straight leg raise. That means that they have compression of the muscles, tightness of the muscles that are restricting their ability to create internal rotation at the pelvis. This would be your deep hip external rotators. Think about like the muscles that are really small that are in here, potentially even your glute max to some extent. And that would be your butt grippers. So this is what has to happen in hip flexion. This is what has to happen in a straight leg raise. But if I have muscles on the back right here, which are pulling this closed, and I need to create a straight leg raise, I'm going to get to about here before I need to create that internal rotation, the opening back here. So exercises that open up this space are going to be great for restoring a straight leg raise and the associated internal rotation. If you get from about 45, beyond that, you need more internal rotation. Remember, the straight leg raise is biasing internal rotation more earlier on because we are getting that femoral IR bias, which feeds into the pelvis in an IR bias. So we're going to be getting earlier needs for internal rotation because of that screw home mechanism. So we're going to be missing the ability to create that if we can't get beyond 45 degrees. If you can get beyond 70-ish degrees, for some people it's 80, 90-ish, we need to actually create a little bit more ER as we get to the end ranges of that straight leg raise. For some people it's 70, other people it's 80. But if someone can get to 80 degrees of a straight leg raise and then they can control it and keep the other leg down, I'm happy. That means that they're doing a great job of creating that relative motion in their pelvis. Think about the genuine measurement we're trying to achieve is relative motion. Think about the compensation we're trying to avoid is an orientation. Everything you see in terms of, most things you see in terms of the compensations is as they bring that leg up, if they roll, orientation. If they roll under, orientation. If that other leg lifts off the ground, they're probably doing this, orientation. That's the secret. It's the secret sauce. Okay. A lot of information. I'm trying to give you as much value as you can get out of this. I really am. If we're trying to improve things, we can think about it like this. Let's say your external rotation was limited. External rotation is paired with abduction. So would it make sense to maybe put a band around the knees and walk sideways? No, why? Because that's just trying to, whether that person is aware of it or not, I've given this slide more than any other slide I think I've ever done. Whether or not that person is aware of it or not, what we're trying to achieve with a mini band sidestep is that we're trying to say, okay, brain, I'm going to recruit this muscle over and over again. I'm going to keep doing this, taking a step out. And I want that via repetition and activation of that muscle to change the position of my pelvis over time. And I want you to be okay with that the more that we do that over time. But really, it's the opposite way around. The brain is going to set where we are safe, where we can go through things via the path of least resistance. And as we can move through the path of least resistance, our brain is going to go, this is the joint position I want you to be in. Do you think, for example, let's go back to that anterior orientation example. Do you think if we're missing internal rotation, our body is going to say, I want to do this, and then I want this to happen? If it can't do that effectively, or is it just going to go missing internal rotation? Let's just dump it forward. So that way we can go forward easier. So that's a safety thing. That is a path of least resistance movement. That is what many people like to do. And that's efficient because that allows us to conserve energy and survive. So if we can tell the brain and the nervous system, hey, maybe this is a more efficient way of doing that, where you can still conserve energy and move forward in space efficiently, then the brain is going to say, okay, let's accept this skeletal position, and let's then adapt to the muscular recruitment that's happening as a result of that skeletal position. So for example, if I wanted to restore my internal rotation, maybe I should get to a hip extended position or a 90 degrees of hip flexed position to allow me to then recruit the muscles I need to restore internal rotation. And I will show you what that looks like in a second. So think about, what are we trying to conserve in terms of energy? Why is the brain allowing that to happen? What's the skeletal position I need to get in to optimally recruit the muscles I want for this whole change to happen? And with mini band side steps, you're doing the opposite of that. Or with fire hydrant kickbacks, glute kickbacks, you're doing the opposite of that. Not to say those are worthless exercises, but hopefully you get the point. So how do we tell the brain this is safe? It's breathing. I'm sure you guys have seen this stuff. If you followed my page, then you know how important and hot breathing is. But honestly, I think people are talking about breathing and it's still not as popular as it should be. I really do think that, because people will get into it. The general progression is they'll get into the whole breathing thing. Then they realize these cool positions they can give their clients or themselves. And then they forget about this part. The difference between success and failure in so many of these ground-based exercises is being able to own it and telling our nervous system that this is a position that we can maintain and adapt to. We can't do that if we're sympathetic fight or flight. That's fight or flight. I already feel more alert after I did that. But if I want to control my breath, if I want to be able to own a position, then I need to breathe through it in the following manner. I want everyone to do this together with me. Take a couple of hyperventilations. Just go 5, okay? You're probably a little bit more hyped up. Now what I want you to do is I want you to link your hands together and put them on your lower ribs. And I want you to feel your sit bones if you're sitting. And I want you to open your mouth, drop your shoulders, relax your jaw, and exhale, sigh it out. Go for 8 to 10 seconds. You're going to feel your obliques engage. Hold that tension in your obliques. Pause, and then inhale. You'll feel your whole rib cage expand, maybe like you've never felt before if you're exhaling long enough. Try that. Now try this. Do the same thing and pause for 3 to 5 seconds between the exhale and the inhale. So it looks like this. You should feel even more of that expansion happening in your rib cage. That's creating more relative motion at both your upper and your lower body, because you're down regulating your nervous system. You should probably feel more calm at this point. I know I do after doing just that right there. So if we want to adapt to things, we want to be able to breathe through it. This is not the same thing as a 1 rep max squat. It's a different context. But if we want to be able to create lasting changes, this over and over again, I see is the difference between success and failure. So what do we do first? Well, we want to make sure that our orientation of our pelvis is not in a position where we are unable to achieve relative motions. So if I'm stuck forward or I'm stuck too far back, if I had sway back posture, for example, let's look at this here. If I'm stuck like this, how am I going to be able to? You're not. We need to be able to come back here, and then we can restore these relative motions. So or get rid of the orientation that's present or manage it. Sometimes orientations are not problems. If you're a 100-meter sprinter, you're an NFL athlete, or you're a high-level basketball player, you probably need your orientation to some extent. It's helping you, but managing it if there's issues are present is really important. If you're really far back here and you got tight glutes, we need to bring you here. But most people have a degree of extension tone present. Most people that have this sway back posture started in a forward pelvis, but they said, oh crap, I'm falling too far forward. So I need to grit my glutes and pull myself underneath me. So we want to take care of that first. And then we want to restore external rotation because that precedes that comes before internal rotation. ER to IR back to ER. In order for us to internally rotate, I hammered that relative thing so hard because for us to be able to create internal rotation and restore it, we need to come from a place of external rotation, and restoring movement is no different. The overwhelming majority of people will benefit more from this approach. Rarely do I go straight after internal rotation primarily. That's not saying I'm doing nothing for internal rotation, but it means that if you're thinking about it as a pie chart, my external rotation bias is significantly larger. Here is a very basic drill you may have seen before for restoring orientation. What that foam roller is doing is just keeping the femur in line with the pelvis and also the tibia and the foot. Here's the thing. I know you guys might be saying, oh, I've seen this 1,000 times. I bet you that you're probably not doing it to the maximal efficiency at which you could. What are we trying to achieve here? Let's break this down. We're trying to achieve a foot position of supination, right? You're relatively supinated in plantar flexion. Your pelvis is in a position where you're not in that much hip flexion. So think about the hip flexion arc, you're in external rotation. Now you're going to be able to move into a position of more of a posterior orientation of the pelvis via the hamstrings. And you are going to move into more of a hip extended position or internally rotated position via creating that extension with the hamstrings. We should not be crunching into this position, which is what almost everyone does. And think about the foot position. We're here, right? Remember I said heel strike ends when this is on the ground and this is on the ground. If we're here, we're not getting that nearly as much. So we're creating this position of plantar flexion, supination, right before we pronate. So this is a heel strike bias. And then as we create that tuck via the hamstrings, not the abs, the hamstrings need to control this, the proximal upper hamstrings. The abs will kick on as a result of that exhale. If you were going through that exhale drill we just did, you should have felt your side abs, your obliques engage because you were exhaling, not because you were crunching. This looks like it's so easy, but I promise you, if you're doing it right, it is just gonna kick your butt. I tell people the downside of these types of exercises is that they're complicated. But the upside is that we're going to have lasting changes because we're addressing so many different sections and processes and systems of the body, the nervous system, the brain, skeletal position, muscular recruitment, references as it relates to gait and the floor, as opposed to just doing a mini band side step, right? Or hamstring curls. Here's another drill. I actually posted about this yesterday. This drill is fantastic because it is going to get you into a more specific position as it relates to human movement. So we are getting internal rotation bias on the leg that's on the wall, external rotation bias of the leg that's off the wall. Remember how whatever is going on one side of the body, the opposite is happening on the other? We're going to go through this with some people after we get through this. So we're getting hip extension on one side, exhaling further up into it, and we're getting hip flexion on the other leg. So this is helping restore the ability to get orientation on one side, but really at the pelvis, what it looks like is this. You're getting a turn because you're in so much hip flexion on one side, extension on the other. This drill is money, and I credit Zach Couples for originating this. Actually, I think he came up with it. Now let's move into restoring some more external rotation via a loaded activity. Again, one of those things you might say, oh, I've seen this 1,000 times. Again, I bet you're not maximizing it because there's some things to think about here. As you go down, what is that band doing? That band is moving us from external to internal rotation. So as we go down, notice how I'm keeping my thorax, my rib cage over my pelvis, being deep into that hip flexion here. So at this deep position right here, I'm in a relatively externally rotated position because of that deep hip flexion bias. But as we move deeper into that, around 90 degrees or more internal rotation, supination, ER here, moving into IR, back out into ER, and then finishing it with hip extension at the top. So in order for us to accomplish this, we need to get a stacked position where our ribs are directly over our hips. If I was extended here, then I would just be dumping my pelvis forward into an orientation. I would not be able to fully get down into that external rotation. So you could do something as simple as this in your warm up, and you might get some hip flexion back. You might get some really nice external rotation gains back. But generally what we want to do is restore the orientation so we can then move into those positions and then load it so that we can adapt to it. I think load is just as important as the ground-based stuff. We can't forget to load after we get into the positions that allow us to achieve that relative motion. We need to create an adaptation both through the nervous system and the skeletal and muscular system as well. Another way you can do it, I remember someone posted, I haven't looked at the chat, but I remember the first question asked is, how do you bias a foot position of supination or external rotation or something like that? Here's how you do it. Elevate the heel, because remember when I said you can bias a pelvic position via a foot position. So if I elevate my whole foot here or my heel, you can use a slant board. I didn't have a slant board at the time, but if I were to refilm this, I would put my whole foot on a slanted surface. We're going to bias external rotation because we are biasing a supinated position of the foot. This is heel strike. We're getting heel strike on the front leg. Think about it like this. If I put one leg out in front of the other, external rotation on this side, and now we're biasing supination of the foot, so we're getting even more of that. Look at it like this. Okay. Striking the ground with my heel. What is my tibia angle here? It's negative, supination. When my tibia angle is vertical, we're in more pronation. So what you're going to get here, if you look at it from the side, you're going to go from a negative tibia angle, relative supination, to more of a vertical one, relative pronation, ER to IR, but we're biasing the ER because of the heel elevation. And the opposite side load too, but that's a different story for a different day. This is one of my favorite activities for restoring internal rotation. It is a rolling activity in hip extension. So this is hard for some people with load. I might just not have someone hold a weight at first, and you can have them go through this dynamically. People like dynamic movement. People like to do things where they're moving. So this is why I incorporated it. But really think about what we're trying to do. We're using the ground as a reference. We got the screw home mechanism here. We got the extension of the leg, internal rotation, and we are rolling over like so. So we're using the floor here. If I'm here, and the floor is here, I'm creating internal rotation. I'm doing this. That makes sense? So you're literally moving the joints in a position where you can open up the space to internally rotate, and then you can train the musculature to then own that joint position in something where you're biasing more 90-ish degrees of hip flexion, like a hinge. On the external rotation split squat, we were biasing supination. This toe elevation is now biasing pronation. This is when we had the slant board. I might need to refilm that other one with this, but you guys get the idea, hopefully. What we're doing is going into that position of hip flexion where we're biasing internal rotation. So now we got the adductor working as an internal rotator. Now we got the glute med, we got the obliques on that side, and we are going to be biasing a lot of IR because of that elevation. For those that are curious, this is about a 10-degree slant board. That's what I would recommend for something like this. But here's what we're trying to do. In this position, I'm trying to drive that right knee forward and stay heavy on my left side. Because if I didn't do that, then my knee would spin out. And I think we have an example of that. It's somewhere in here. Yeah, you see how if this leg comes back, if your stance is too staggered, it's no good. So we want to make sure that that knee is going forward because that's going to facilitate this happening. Internal rotation on one side. You're still getting IR on this side, but it's relatively less because we're trying to create that sacrum facing this way. Turning to the left, back foot. So that's a way you can open up the space for the joints to move in and then load it. And there you go. Getting some major IR back. Straight leg raise should improve. If you do those two things back to back and you do them well, straight leg raises tend to fly. So we're going to go through the practical stuff in a second, but I bet you're wondering a couple of things. What about the upper body? How does that relate? How do I incorporate this into a model that works for me? How can I use these to improve hypertrophy and strength qualities? Because ultimately, as trainers, we're here to give a fitness experience, but we need to be able to move to achieve that, right? What about asymmetrical patterns? And how can I see more examples and case studies? How can I see this in a model, a total context of a program? Well, today, guys, I have the most exclusive offer I have ever had for my biomechanics program. It is an absolutely massive discount. Originally it's $625, now it's $439. This is going to apply for exactly 2 days. You have an email in your inbox right now with the offer. It is going to expire. It will never, ever, ever, ever be offered again. I promise you that. But for this one time, for the next 2 days, you have an incredible opportunity to get 30% off. It's never been offered before, will never be offered again. So I highly recommend you check that out in your email. I will also be sending out an email with some YouTube links for all the videos you saw in here, because I think it's really important to be able to have those, be able to study them, mess around with them, and see what works and what doesn't for you. In terms of how we go over this course, we're going to spend a lot of time establishing the basics. I have reorganized this. I've done this course enough times to know how the general flow works and what works best for most people. So we're going to go after establishing the basics. Some of the stuff we talked about today, a lot of it we have not. We're going to put it in a grand, big context for you guys. Then we're going to get into how asymmetrical patterns affect it, how our genetic biases affect it, how infrasternal angles, if you've ever heard that, how those affect it. Then we get into assessments, how we can read compensatory patterns based off of visual and assessment protocols. And then what can we do with the ground-based stuff to open up the space for the joints to move? How can we load it in week 8? Then how can we get better athletic movement, quality, speed out of these biomechanical principles? And actually, it also does apply to energy systems, which is personally my favorite and most interesting week. And that's really something that people tend to enjoy. Then we get into case studies. I show you 3 clients that their whole program, the whole shebang. So you see it in this big programmed context that is really important for people to see. Then I give you an example client, or you can use one of your own. And you can then, we just did this the past couple of weeks. You program it out, and then you can present it, or you can have me look at it, and we'll give you some feedback and make sure that you are confident and able to move forward with these concepts in a practically applicable environment. A lot of people have taken this course. I believe it's over 750 in 2021 alone. And we have currently, I believe, around 150 signed up for this current course. So if you're interested, a lot of high-level people have taken it, have great things to say about it. You jump on that deal now, because it is never going to be around again. Okay, with that out of the way, my sales pitch is done. Let's go through some practical stuff. I want you guys to still be able to know how to do this stuff instead of just sitting here listening to me talk about it. So what we'll do, what I recommend is turning off your video if you don't want to be seen. Keep your video on if you're cool with me using you as an example, because that would be really, really helpful. I really hope everyone doesn't shut off their video. But if you want some feedback as to what things look like, it would be really great for a couple of you guys to at least have your video on. We're going to go through the assessments first, and we're going to see what works, and we're going to see potentially what exercises we can use for this person. Okay, let's do the active hip extension first. I will reshare my screen so we can see what that looks like, because we have covered a lot of ground since that. Whoops. Here we go. Active hip extension. This is the first one we're going to do. So let's take a look at the video. Lay on your side and then have a 90-degree bend at both your knees and your hips. And then bring one leg back. And the key is can you get that leg all the way back without your back arching and without your leg moving up or down excessively? Let's go through it. Pretty simple. Let's see what we got. Who's up? If you guys don't mind, a couple of you with your video on would be sweet, or else we're not really going to be able to show anyone anything. Let's go 90-90, laying on your side. Hopefully, if you guys want to face, yeah, like Evelyn's got it down. Evelyn's doing a great job of the angle right there. Thank you, Evelyn. So I'm going to spotlight. Can you bring your other leg up to about 90 degrees too there, Evelyn? Thank you. All right. Yep. So let's see what happens here. You can tell she gets to right about there, and give me a thumbs up if you feel like your back's going to extend. Yep. Yep. So she's doing a really good job of keeping awareness of that happening. Show us what happens if you just let it happen anyway. Boom. Yep. Let's see your other side, Evelyn. I think I just lost you there. There you go. Let's see that other side. Usually people have asymmetries to a certain extent. Oh, looks like that side's potentially a little bit easier for you. What do you think? Give me a thumbs up or thumbs down. Which you can unmute yourself and chat about it if you'd like.
Yeah, so the right side cramped up like crazy.
And this is your left.
And this is the left.
Does it feel easier on your left?
Not really. It's cramping up too now.
Okay.
Well,
Okay. We'll see if we can do something about that later. Who else can we use as an example here? Let's see. Tate doing a good job of showing us what that looks like. Show us right to where about right there. So you're maybe 10, 20 degrees short there. See what your other side looks like. He's doing a good job of keeping everything in line there. I can't tell if it's the angle, but what side felt easier for you there, Tate?
Right felt way easier.
Right felt way easier. That's usually what we would expect to see for a lot of people. And that's, again, a different thing. Let's see Johnson. Hey, Johnson, can you show us what your hip extension looks like?
Is my angle okay from here?
I think if you face the other, like kind of face downstream, that would be
I bring
good.
my feet this way?
Yeah, like that. That would be ideal. So he's pretty short, right? Pretty short there.
Yeah, it feels tight already.
Yeah, let's flip you over to your other side.
I can feel it back extending there.
Yep. Okay, so I would say that definitely short significantly on that, but you look like a pretty strong buff dude, which is what a lot of people that are in his sort of circumstances will present with. So now let's do hip flexion. For this, you guys maybe put your foot up against a wall, put both feet up against a wall, stay nice and straight, keep the other leg down, pull your knee to your chest without using your hands. This is the one where we're really going to be able to see with the hip extension, unless you're looking down like we did with, I believe Evelyn gave us a really good angle with that. It's kind of hard to tell, especially online. But let's check this hip flexion here. Let's go Evelyn first because we've already seen her. Oh, let's go bent knee there, Evelyn. Yeah, there we go. So it looks like she doesn't have bad hip flexion. Go one more time slowly from the beginning for us. Right there, yeah. Around 100 degrees, I start to see that other leg want to pop up a little bit potentially. Let's see your other side. Which side feels easier? Give me a L or R, or like just point. That's fine. Your left. The left side usually has more external rotation, which is usually why you see a better left hip flexion. Let's stick with who we've seen. Johnson. Oh, let's go Tate. Let's go Tate first. Let's go in order. Spotlight for everyone. So Tate gets to about 110. Other side. Doing a good job of making sure he's not rolling at all. That right side is definitely more limited. What happens if you go further with that right side? Let's show him the compensation. Keep going, keep going. You see how the other leg lifts off there? That's what you'll see time and time again. Thank you, Tate. And then let's go back to our friend Johnson here. All right, let's see what you got, man. So he gets to, one more time, nice and slow through that end range of motion. Slow, slow, slow. Right around 85, that leg starts lifting up. That's when I would call that. Let's see the other side. I cannot tell if your other leg's coming up because I have the camera, but which one felt easier for you, Johnson?
I definitely felt better on my right side. As I was bringing up my left leg, I definitely got a lot of jamming. Right
You felt some
about-
pinchiness in that left hip?
Yeah, right about there.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And let's go straight leg raise for you guys. Let's see what that looks like. Keep that leg perfectly straight. If you see one little itty bitty degree of bending, that's game over. I'm going to spotlight Evelyn first. So Evelyn gets to about 40 degrees or even maybe 35. And you feel that tightness there? Yeah. All right. Other side. Left one's a pinch better, but not by a whole lot. All right, Johnson, let's see yours.
Okay, so I've actually been doing some of your drills from your video, so it's actually a lot better, but it's still pretty rough.
Okay. Keep those toes pulled back. Oh, you got some deep. So both Johnson and Evelyn have compression of their back pelvis. Those deep hip external rotators are tight, tight, tight.
Yeah, like right there. That's like really tight right here.
Yeah, yeah. All right, and then Tate, let's check you out really quick. One more time. Right about, yeah, right about 65 degrees, that other leg starts coming up. See the other side. The shadows are harder to tell, but it looks like the leg maybe stays down better with this. So it gets to about 70, 75 potentially on that right side. All right, let's do some work. So if you guys wouldn't mind, I'm gonna have all three of you guys go through it. I'm gonna pin all three of you at the same time. Spotlight, spotlight. Let's see, where did Johnson go? Spotlight, and then where did Tate go? All right, guys, so we're gonna do the supine wall stride first, and this is what it entails. So I want y'all to get in a position where you are 90-90 on the wall. That's all you need is a wall. And I want you to reach your, let's start with your left leg on the wall. Let's get your right leg pulled back. And I want you to get your right arm overhead. And I want you to about 120 degrees. Yeah, it doesn't really matter all that much. And then your left arm is reaching directly up towards the ceiling. And then pronate that palm. So have it face that wall as well. I want you guys at perfect 90-90. So Tate, I might have you scoot a hair bit closer to the wall. There we go. Now what I want you guys to do, you shouldn't feel any pinching in your hips. It should feel totally chill. So what I want you to do is feel your inner edge of your foot arch, that tripod. So I want you to feel the ball of your big toe, the ball of your little toe, and your heel. So boom, 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 right here. And then focus on the ball of the big toe, the met head, not the actual toe, and then focus on that heel and push into the wall. And you should feel a little bit of glute on that side. Now, what I want you to do is tuck your hips and exhale and get your hips slightly off of the floor. That should kick on that glute a hell of a lot more. Give me a thumbs up if you're feeling that. All right, keep that other arm overhead, the one that's not reaching directly up. So Johnson, I'd get that other leg, that right arm over your head like so. And then more like on the ground. So like back like that. Okay. So what we'll do here is I want you to exhale softly like we talked about. And I want you to get your hips slightly higher in the air. Think about rolling your hips underneath yourself, reaching your back pocket towards your heel, and bring that free knee towards your nose. Don't let it deviate out to the side. Keep it in towards your nose, just 1 inch at a time in terms of your hips going higher, 1 inch more of your knee going towards your nose. You should feel no pinching. It should be a lot of glute. Exhale till you feel those abs. Pause, hold it. Inhale through your nose. It should be a lot of glutes, a lot of side abs. Just go nice and slow through that. Pause, inhale through your nose, nice and relaxed. Exhale through your mouth. Keep going. Get your hips in full extension. You should stay tucked. Your low back should not be arched at all. Looking really good, looking really good. And relax. Check your hip flexion again. Do both sides, see what happens. Ooh, Evelyn, that looks nice. Johnson. So this is an example of Johnson is a big, strong guy. So he's not going to see as much of a range of motion change as someone like Evelyn will. So Evelyn looks like she got some nice range. That feel a little bit better, Evelyn? Yeah. Tate, let's see you.
Mine felt better too, sorry.
Your felt better? How'd that left hip pinchy feel? Good. Tate, one more time. Sorry, I took my eyes off you. Nice. Now Tate's getting back to 120, nice and easy. Good stuff. Potentially straight leg raise could improve. Let's see what happened with that. What was that, Evelyn?
I was just saying, what if you felt it more in your hamstring than your glute on that drill?
You probably weren't pushing into the wall with the right reference. So I would create that inner edge foot arch sense. Yeah. Let's go straight leg raise. Yeah, Tate's is nice. Hey, Evelyn. Good gains there. Good gains there. Okay. Johnson probably needs some rolling in his life because he's got a lot of compression there. Oh, that right one's looking nicer. Good stuff, brother. Good stuff. All right. Check your hip extension too. Your active hip extension. So I believe all of you were relatively short. Nice. Should feel a little bit better. I can't tell with you, Johnson. You're going to have to report back because your back was facing. Ooh, Johnson, you got some range there for sure. Good work. All right, guys. Does anyone have a weight? Any weights? All right. Let's try, if you have access to a dumbbell, barbell, whatever, let's try a little bit of that rolling. See what happens. So ideally, in a perfect world, I might have all three of these people do that supine wall stride on both sides, but we're gonna bypass that for the purposes of time. So what I want you guys to do, pay very close attention to how I cue this and coach this. So what I want you to do is start with your arm overhead, and that arm overhead is going to be the same of the one that's flexed. So you gotta Start with your leg down, locked out, toes pulled back. And that arm needs to be overhead. So what I want you to do is keep that down leg locked out and toes pulled back. That's going to give you that screw home internal rotation. And then I want you to reach that bell up towards the ceiling, maybe 10 pounds, maybe 10 pounds. Johnson, you might want, no, I think 10 pounds will be good for everyone-ish, 10, 15. I want you guys to keep that leg locked out, other legs at 90. And I want you to simultaneously roll your hip and your shoulder at the same time. Keep that arm overhead. And you should feel like you are easier able to roll because you're inhaling. So as you inhale, I want you to roll. It's going to inflate you like a balloon so that you can roll. Inhale, roll at the same time. There we go, Evelyn. You're starting to get it. Get that shoulder stacked at that in position. Good. Keep that leg on the ground. Keep that right knee in contact with the ground. Good. And then exhale, roll back. Evelyn's doing a good job of this, going really, really slow, going really, really slow.
I don't have a weight. Should I just go weightless or should I like fill up a water bottle or something?
You could go weightless, but I think for you, weight might benefit you potentially, but try it without weight, see what happens. Yeah. Sometimes with really strong people, they really struggle to actually roll with the weight, or they need that compression because load is how they got to where they are. They need load to get out of it. Good job, Evelyn. Nice job. Keep that leg locked out.
Sorry, could you re-cue me, please?
Absolutely. So you're going to start with that down leg locked out, other leg flex to 90. So for you, I'd roll to your left there, Johnson. So pull that leg back, that right leg back to 90. And then that down leg is locked out at 90 degrees. Your left arm is overhead. Your right leg is reaching towards the ceiling. Keep that leg straight there, Evelyn. Straight, locked out. And you're going to simultaneously roll your shoulder and hip as you inhale through your nose. That's better, Evelyn. Make sure that dumbbell is stacked over your shoulder. Nice. Good job, Tate. Looking nice, looking nice, looking nice. So you're going to roll the other way, Johnson. I want you to roll to the left, keeping your leg locked out. And you want your left arm overhead and your right leg reaching at 90. You can watch what Evelyn's doing. That might give you a pretty good idea of what we're going for here. You see that? Nice. All right, Evelyn, let me see your left straight leg raise now. And Tate, you can do yours too if you feel like you were doing the reps well. Johnson, you want to roll to the left there. You want the top leg to come over. Yep. Ooh. Yeah, nice job, Evelyn. Good stuff. Keep that other leg down there, Tate. That's better, Johnson, but you need to keep that left leg straight. That left arm is directly over your head like so. We'll get you there. We'll get you there. Evelyn, that was sweet. Tate, did yours feel a little bit easier?
Yeah, tiny bit. I think the wall strider might have been a little better for it.
I think so, because your hamstrings are off of the ground more so. So that shows me that we need to work on your orientation more before we go and try to restore internal rotation.
Yeah, okay.
It's principles at work right there. So guys, hopefully that was a cool demo. And that just goes to show that going in order of things is important. We have 3 different people and we got rid of Johnson, some of that pinching in that left hip, which was nice. We'll get that rolling looking good. Evelyn, straight leg raise and hip flexion were so much better. And Tate, I think your hip flexion when you did that wall strider was like 15 degrees better on the left side. So that was sweet.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Okay, guys. Hopefully that was a cool demo. Hopefully that was helpful. And this is stuff you can do with your clients tomorrow or later today if you want. I'll send you those videos. And if you guys are interested in getting a ton more of that, check out the discount that is in your email right now. I'm happy to answer any questions you guys have at this point. And I'm going to go in order of the chat right here. How would you cue ER of the pelvis from Julian? So in terms of ER of the pelvis, what we're going to be getting is heel strike. That's usually what we want to do because many people are forward. Let me remove some spotlights here so I can get myself in. There we go. So many people are forward on both sides. We want to restore that orientation and that ability to then access ER, relative motion. We can do that via positions that bias supination of the foot. We can do that via loads that are more contralateral in nature. So if I have my left foot forward, holding the weight in the right hand, helps me create a little bit more ability to sense the heel. This might be better. This might be better to show you guys in a standing environment here. So if I were to hold the weight in my right hand here, I am better able to go down and sense that heel. But if I have the weight in the left hand, we turn away from load. So I would open this up and I would go more forward here onto my forefoot. So opposite side loads are really good for that. And lower levels of hip flexion are good for that too. Remember that 0 to 60 thing. So other question, I got some direct ones. People are asking if this is going to be on YouTube. Yes, it will. Where did I get my pelvic models from? 3B Scientific. I need to hit them up and get an affiliate code because I've sent so many people to there, but they're great. Honestly, I'm not affiliated with them whatsoever, but 3B Scientific is where I get those. Any other questions? You guys are free to unmute yourself. You're free to ask anything you want. So we got one here. How much would you prescribe these movements to individuals? I would say depends on the needs, right? So if someone didn't have any issues, I might do 1 to 2 in prep and I wouldn't really worry about it. Maybe we want to restore a little movement, maybe not. Our goal is to give people a fitness experience. I try to hammer that with people and understand that we are not here to just rehab everyone we see, but this can be very helpful for improving movement for performance as well, as we talk about later in the program. But if someone does have issues, then I'm going to probably give them 2-ish sets in their prep, 1 set after their training session. And if it's on an off day, I'll say 2 in the morning, 1 to 2 at night. So that way it's spread out and they're getting that consistent input. Quality reps. Please explain ipsilateral loading and relative pelvic motion. So if I had a weight in my hand, imagine if you were doing a suitcase carry, for example. Okay. If I had a suitcase carry, what am I going to want to do? I'm going to want to turn away from it, right? I'm going to want to do that so I don't get pulled down here. So the pelvis acts the same way. If I had a weight in my left hand and my left leg was forward, I'm going to want to turn away from it. So we're going to be biasing more of this action, which is going to be this, whereas that's going to be potentially, and it depends, like, do you have an elevation? Like, are you doing a shift? Like, how are you doing it? If I had an opposite side load, I would be more biased towards, again, because this leg is forward, I'm in ER, but I'd be better able to maintain that ER on the way down, and I could easily shift towards that stance leg, whereas that's much harder with a weight here. I can shift better here with a contralateral load because my thorax is helping me turn into that side. Okay.
Can I ask a question? Is that okay?
Sure, Johnson. Let me get through these next 2 in the chat, and then I'll get to you.
Sounds good.
With the rolling drill, do you inhale and hold, or do you roll, or are you inhaling? So I'm inhaling as we roll. My man, Tony. Do you have any sources that validate the model of compression and expansion in terms of, what do you mean by validating? I think just getting results validates. I mean, I don't have to justify a lot of what results are speaking for necessarily, but if you're looking for peer-reviewed studies, things like that, the expansion and compression model, quote unquote, is really a thing that was founded by Bill Hartman, which is really based a lot in other systems. I know that PRI is where I get most of my information from, and they have an extensive list of cited sources. The whole idea of expansion and compression is really just a different lingo of speaking about what a lot of PRI stuff is already talking about. So if you want those studies, they have a pretty extensive list. I'd be happy to send you a lot of what they got in terms of their cited studies, because they definitely make sure that they have that. So let me know if you want that. But in terms of like infrasternal angles and things like that, if you don't know what that is, don't worry about it. There's nothing on it. It's really a theory more than anything else. Do you have what? I'm from Belgium, and the teachers who will judge my work are not very informed of English content. Oh, I see. Are this problem possible correlated with acute low back pain sacrum when squatting or deadlifting? The strange thing is there isn't any pain with unilateral movement like a heavy split squat. Ask yourself why that is. Why would there be pain with a bilateral lift and not a unilateral lift? Unilateral lifts help promote more relative motion because you're literally in a split stance usually, or some sort of offset stance. So if I am experiencing back pain, then I am doing both things on both sides of the body at the same time when I'm doing a bilateral lift. So if I have an asymmetrical pelvis or whatever, and I try to load that, then I'm going to have to compensate to create that same joint action on both sides. But remember, if I have an asymmetrical pelvis, you can't have a higher hip on one side without having a lower hip on the other. You can't have more ER on one side without having more IR on the other. So you're basically creating less of a need to do that with unilateral movement. You're getting more relative motion and not forcing an orientation. And we'll find the path of least resistance, which ends up being orientation in many cases. Johnson, you can ask your question now.
Thanks. Okay, so my question was regarding the hip flexion drill or the hip flexion assessment. So you mentioned that between 60 to 110 degrees, that's a sign of internal rotation. That's correct?
On hip flexion that's 60 to about 110. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I meant. And then conversely from 130 degrees and onwards, that's a sign of excessive anterior pelvic tilt, right?
Yes.
So my question was, my understanding was that like an internal rotation is also like a sign of anterior pelvic tilt. So if that's true, then like how are they both like kind of the same like anterior pelvic tilt situation, but different, expressed in different ways?
Good question. So anterior pelvic tilt, what that does is that literally biases you towards a position where your femurs can access internal rotation, put force into the ground. Think about what happens when you're going through a really heavy back squat and you are at the sticking point of it. And what do you do to help get yourself up? You extend your back, because that allows you to put that force into the ground, orient yourself in a position successfully in many cases, which allows you to do that, which is good. It's not a bad thing. It's just, are you stuck there? Now, think about what that is versus this, right? So if I don't have this, which is from the pelvis down feeding into the femurs, then I'm going to do this. So this is a compensation for internal rotation or a substitution for it. Some people have a genetic bias where they're biased towards a pelvis that is externally rotated. This is a lot of females. They have this sort of a pelvis. Now, are they going to compensate and find this? No, what they're going to do is they're going to find one joint higher at the lumbar spine. They get pushed forward. Now they're here, but they're still relatively in counter nutation ER here. It's just now their whole pelvis is oriented forward, which allows them to pick up room to internally rotate. Does that make sense?
Yeah, right. So in one example, like you have a full anterior orientation, and in addition to that, you also have the anterior pelvic tilt, but then in the other one, it's just one is more present than, and the anterior pelvic tilt is still present, but you're still externally rotated.
Relatively, you're externally rotated, but your whole pelvis is facing down now, so you can then, put force into the ground.
Thank you.
Good question. Let's see. We got one here. Rear foot elevated stance, is that helping regain IR? Rear foot elevated, think about what that does. If I'm in a rear foot elevated position, I'll use my couch for this. If I'm here, what is that doing? That's pushing more weight onto my forefoot to start. So as I go down, I have this vertical shin angle, which is more IR. And as I push out of it, I'm going to be going back into ER. So you're really going from IR to ER. You're still going ER, IR, ER. At the top, you're in relative ER. Bottom, you're at more IR, pushing back up. But you're biasing more of that IR. At the bottom, pushing out of it at the top. So that would be more of a mid to late stance bias. How would you explain to a powerlifter or someone who has really reinforced their bracing and are being too tense, PRI movements and stretches? Well, I would, anytime I'm struggling with buy-in, I will get this person to just say, give me 5 minutes, I'll go, and I will show them what their range of motion is, do a drill, show their improvements, and then have them go lift, which should, in many cases, carry over. And if it doesn't, then I know that they're either loading too much and we need to back off. But if I see a change on the table that's significant and they're not bought in at that point, then we need to show them with load how that can be more effective. So, okay, now let's have you squat and let's look at how that hip shift looks in your squat. Let's look at how your back feels after you squat. And usually I've never needed more than that for pretty much anyone. How can I solve? Okay, so I see at the bottom of a squat, a low right hip and a high left hip. How can I solve this bad orientation? I don't know if it's bad, right? Like a lot of these things we can look at and start labeling as if they're not good. I would ask, are you in pain? Do you feel like that's affecting your performance in any way? If the answer is no. Do we need to fix it? I don't know. But I would say if you do have problems as a result of that, and your right shoulder drops down like the hip and pelvis are very connected in that sense. So I would say that's more of an asymmetrical thing. Look at my YouTube video on lateral pelvic tilt. But if you do have a lower right hip, then what that is telling me is that it's hard to make this really simple. But what you're probably doing is either when you're going to the bottom of a squat, you're running out of hip flexion on one side. So you're doing that, right? Or you are turning your pelvis in a way where you're orienting like this. So you have like lateral pelvic tilt on with a higher left hip and maybe you're forward. So when you go down, your right hip is lower. It's one of those two things probably, which then affects your upper body. Can you attribute any of the lack of straight leg raise range of motion towards hamstrings? I think, again, think about muscular function is a secondary consequence of joint position. So yeah, for sure, hamstrings are going to be a limiting factor, but why is your hamstring a limiting factor? Joint position. These are good questions. Do we have any more?
I got one, Connor, just asking about the sacrum and wondering if it's an easy way to think about the reciprocating nature and position of right hip versus left hip is to think about what direction the sacrum is kind of facing. Just what your thoughts are on that.
Can you give me clarify that question for me?
So like with the ipsilateral versus contralateral load, if I go ipsilateral on the right side, I know that that's going to force me to turn my sacrum to the left. And turning my sacrum to the left biases ER of that front side, correct?
Right.
So I'm just asking if like that's a helpful way to think about what one hip is doing versus the other hip, like literally the direction the sacrum is oriented in.
Yeah, honestly, it is, right? Because if you are in more ER on one side, you're going to have to be in more IR on the other side, right?
Yeah.
I think it's helpful.
Okay. Thanks.
Good question. Anything else?
I have another question, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. So in the gait cycle, if I notice somebody who's walking and they don't push off their ball, like in late stance, they don't push off the ball of their foot, would that mean that would that mean they're like stuck in a midfoot bias if they just kind of lift up their foot without pushing off that late
So
stance?
as opposed to this, they're doing what? Are they kind of like rolling, or are they just kind of like staying supinated?
Yeah, it looks like it for me, it looks more like a supinated foot lift.
Yeah. So they're
Instead of
like
push
doing
off.
this, not actually pronating, then kind of rolling off to the side.
Mhm.
So that's a classic person who is missing internal rotation at, probably their tibia for sure, because the tibia has to do this for that foot to pronate. And that's probably going to be fed up to the hip. So what a lot of people will do, I'd be curious if this person does something like that, because they can't do that forever. You have to find internal rotation. They're going to either anteriorly orient at the hip. They're going to turn the leg out, because if you turn your foot out and then you strike the ground, what does that allow you to do? It allows you to sense that inner edge of your foot easier. Or what they're going to do is continue to be into that pattern, but what they're going to end up doing is probably experiencing some degree of it could be so many different things. They're probably going to be stuck with some degree of plantar fasciitis. They could have a bunion to a certain extent, because if you can't pronate, you're going to go on the front of your toes. And if you go on the front of your toes, you're going to be like this all the time. Because when we push off in late stance, you need to do this, and your toes do go inward to a certain extent. So what that person will probably do is they'll bypass their internal rotation. So for them to push, they have to go on their toes. And over time, that feeds into this sort of a foot presentation.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. If someone complains a lot about back pain and refers to it as overly activating during a lot of exercises, should you test for orientation? Yes, Franco, I would. That person's probably oriented in an anterior orientation, and they need to come back first. Any other questions? I'll be here until you guys run out. That was a phone alarm. Thank you. Appreciate the kind words. Anything at all? Going once? Going twice?
I have one more if you can.
There we go. What's up?
So if the foot goes into external rotation or supination right off liftoff during gait, would that be an internal rotation bias?
Say that one more time.
So the foot immediately off liftoff during gait, it goes into external rotation.
As it should, right? Once you lift your foot off and you resupinate.
But more supination on one side versus the other, would that be?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So if one side is more pronated than the other, or one side is more in a static posture pronated, think about how that is probably going to imply what's happening at the hip. So in the course, we talk about visual foot presentations and what that can imply about the potential assessments. So for example, let me make sure I'm big here. If I have a more pronated foot on one side and a more supinated foot on the other, what is that doing? That foot is pushing me into this hip or this. So if I walk like that, I'm probably more on the forefoot of this side, because I'm going to enter gait in a pronated state. And that's going to push me over to this side like so. So think about how that could potentially be feeding into what you're seeing during gait. Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely.
Mm-hmm. Thank you guys for the kind words. I appreciate that. Going once, twice. Connie, do you have a question? Okay, that's it, guys. Thank you. Thank you for being a part of this. I really appreciate it. Check your emails. You're for sure going to be getting that YouTube playlist very, very soon. And I appreciate you guys' time today. This will be on YouTube shortly if you want to rewatch it. A lot of information. I hope it helps. Go try this stuff out. It works. I'll see you guys later.